All right, welcome everybody. So this is the April GeauxAgile meeting. Here's the agenda so far. So far we've had about 15 or 20 minutes to eat some jambalaya. We'll continue to do that throughout the meeting. I'm going to have some announcements that we'll go through in just a few minutes. And then after that, Forrest is going to give a presentation on Kanban. And then I'm going to pull up some slides. It's not really a presentation, but talk about Agile mindset. And then afterwards, we'll have some closing comments. So,
all right, before I get started, let me get a show of hands. How many people have heard of Kanban, know how to use it? About half the room. What about Scrum? More of the room, okay. So our agenda, we're going to look at Kanban, we're going to define it, get some fun facts about it, where it came from. We'll talk about Marion Times Lean, how they created it, and then they spawned off what's called Kanban development. A lot of people have heard of Kanban, but a lot of people that have heard of Kanban have never heard of Kanban development. Talk about some goals of Lean, motivation of Kanban, why would you do it, do you need to do it, maybe compare it with Scrum, and then we'll do some Q&A. So it'll be just a general introduction. So Kanban, created by Toyota, Taichi Ono, it's just a system to control a logistical chain from a production point of view. When you think about moving cars and all these automobile parts, some of it doesn't really transpire to software development, and that was kind of the motivation when a guy named David Anderson took some of the Lean goals and he created what's called the Kanban method, and that's what most people think about Kanban when they think about Kanban and software development. Kanban is just, if you take the word in Japan, it means visual card. And Lean, how many people have heard of Lean? Pretty impressive. So Lean has all these guidelines which we're getting built into Kanban: eliminate waste, learning, decide as late as possible. That way we can avoid rework in the face of change. We want to deliver as fast as possible, get all these feedback loops to get the input. Always empower your team, build integrity in. It makes a lot of sense to try to manage quality and get it right the first time if you can. And then see the whole, like begin with the end in mind. The one that's real important is waste. When you think about waste in software, you think about things like waiting, code waiting to be tested, requirements waiting to be coded. And you got like inventory, which is partially done work. Then there's defects, that's another waste, you have to go fix that. Then there's extra processing, things like that. Context switching, it's no surprise a lot of developers get on multiple projects, and we can probably spend 30 minutes talking about the evils of context switching. Anyone in here not have that problem in your shops? Just curious. Yeah, that seems to be the norm. So, it's Kanban Dev. It's relatively new to software development, I think about 20 years. There's a good book. I think Brian has that book actually by David Anderson. And basically Kanban development is just for software. It's just a framework like any Agile framework where you want to collaborate to optimize the whole. You want to get things done as fast as possible and good stuff like that. So let's think about motivation, why you should use Kanban. Here are some of the top reasons. And actually, after we go through the thing, we'll talk about this, Kanban versus Scrum, if it would make sense in your shop as an open discussion. But here are some of the common ones. We've done Scrum for so long. We're all experienced Scrum practitioners. We actually can, remove some of the constraints of Scrum and take our process to the next level. And that's debatable. Priorities shift. Think about production support departments where they can't just go set a 2-week sprint goal. Things pop, breaks. So you need to switch priorities like that. And then there are some companies where they just fixed length iterations just don't work for them. So that's it for the basic stuff. Now we're going to talk about setting up Kanban. Kanban just has 5 little rules, 5 constraints. I think Scrum has about 19 if you read them all out and take them to completion. The first step and this is what I think everyone who attempts Kanban gets right. They visualize their workflow, and then they set up their workflow states. This is one where you got, I don't know, 4 workflow states. You may set one up in your company where your workflow states are 8, 9, 10, 2. It just depends. Kanban doesn't try to change the way you do work. It just wants to take a snapshot of it and try to help you optimize your process. So the next rule of Kanban is we've all heard of WIP limits. We want to limit our work in progress. That way we can measure bottlenecks. So if you look at the diagram, you'll see in these workflow states these numbers: select it, develop, deploy. You know, we can deploy 1 thing at a time, develop 3 things at a time, 2 things at a time. So WIP is a thing that you need to constantly inspect and adapt. You can't really get hung up on it like, oh, we only have 2, we can't do anything else. It's, you know, you're going to have to go through some iterations to find the ideal WIP limits. I kind of, you know, as I'm doing this, I'm doing some personal Kanban right now for the last couple months, and I'm actually still 2 months in. I have not found my optimal WIP limits yet. I'm getting closer and closer to figuring that out, but it's something that you need to just measure and adjust to keep the bottlenecks down. Third thing is measure cycle time, and possibly one of the most important is if I'm going to take some work from here to here and I want to objectively measure how can we get it down, well, we need to know what we measured. It's just that simple. That's how they did it at Toyota. That's where Kanban really got popular. They measured all this stuff and they are like, well, do we have waste? Can we get it down? Speed the process up. Maybe in software your average cycle time is 3 days, 5 minutes for every item that comes in. And maybe that's great. Maybe you can find some things and get it down to 2.5 days. So that's your cycle time. Some Agile practitioners and project management practitioners call this lead time, but it's just the time to complete something from start to finish. And here's the last 2 policy principles of Kanban. This is the ones where, surprisingly, I see a lot of people that talk about Kanban. I don't see them doing these, like making their process policies explicit. So I kind of like this little visual right here. You got all your workflow states: next, analysis, development, acceptance. And I know it's a little hard to see down there, but you'll see they actually have a definition of done for each workflow state. So it's real objective. Are we done with analysis? Well, what does done look like? A lot of people just move the cards and it's not so objective. So when you get objective like that and you have your policies explicit, well, then you can really get into the hard discussions and figure out, you know, how to improve. And the 5th one, like all Agile flavors, is to continue to improve collaboratively. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of Kanbans, you know, when I see a lot of people talking about that, I don't see a lot of them talking about, you know, improving collaborative. They all talk about just visualizing and moving cards around, which is unfortunate. Kanban is not very prescriptive at all whatsoever. This is a discipline framework. So it's up to us, you know, if you're going to do Kanban, you need to inspect and adapt. You got to be real disciplined. You got to keep yourself very honest. So most of the room in here knew Scrum, half knew Kanban. I got just 2 quick slides right here to just show like some quick Kanban versus Scrum comparisons. We talked about the iteration where Kanban iterations are optional. The great thing about Kanban is it doesn't tell you can't really do any of this. You can do it if it adds value to your team and your organization, and that's up to you to find out. So that's why when I talked about motivation earlier, a lot of teams, when they say why Kanban, they'll take all these constraints over here, and maybe to them, you can argue that that's some form of waste. Why do we need to wait 2 weeks to do a retrospective? Why can't I talk to Peter today and tell him, hey, we just did something wrong. We need to improve our policy right now. Let's not wait 2 more weeks. Forecasting in Scrum, we forecast. Kanban, that's optional. Big difference in measurement. Scrum's big on velocity, Kanban's big on cycle time. Cross-functional teams in Scrum, specialist teams are allowed in Kanban if you need to go that route. WIP is a good one right there. In Scrum, your WIP is actually limited per sprint. So when you do Scrum, one of the rules that we always need to remember is that our sprints are protected. They stay locked. Once we make our forecast, we don't really change that unless we get done early or some crazy reason where we need to cancel a sprint or negotiate with a product owner. But for the most part, they're protected. And Kanban is just protected by that workflow state. You're trying to find that ideal workflow state. And I like Kanban where it says estimation is optional. I mean, no management wants to ever hear that. We all got to estimate some kind of way, but the way Kanban says it is, it's not a rule for us. It's just optional if you need to do it. Like you can measure points, total points left. If you need to do it, you can measure cycle time based on how many items you got left and come up with the same thing. And maybe that's more practical because it's not just a theory through planning poker. It's actually real things that went from start to finish. We talked about the protection. Kanban has no roles, none whatsoever. Now that's not to say that if you need roles, you can't add roles, because you can if they add value. Kanban is just letting you do what you need to do. Same thing with prioritization. I mean, that one's kind of odd. It's not a constraint. Most people are going to have some type of priority. You'll see a lot of Kanban set up, and they'll have the express lane at the top, when things, emergency items, that's high priority. So this is just my slide right here that I came up with, playing with Kanban for the last 3 to 6 months. Although Kanban does not prescribe these things, if I was consulting with someone about Kanban, these are things I would probably say they're very Kanban-friendly Scrum things, what I call them. I would do them even in Kanban, at least to start. I like the idea, even for Kanban, doing a daily stand-up with your team, synchronizing with them, looking them in the eye. I love the definition of done. For your, you want to make your policies explicit. And the roles. Roles can help, but just make the roles to where the roles add value to the process. Don't just add roles to say, we have roles. Reviews, that's another big thing. I mean, that's one of those things where in Scrum we do that sprint review every 2 weeks, every 1 week, whatever your iteration length is. That's up to your team, and how you guys are structured. But I think they're important in Kanban. Sorry? Oh, they're having a party out there, man.
I know. We are having a party too. We are
This should. Looks like he was successful.
Yeah, it won't last.
It's one of those 5-minute things, huh? Almost. So
we are celebrating that you were able to apply.
You need to do that iteratively.
every 5 minutes. The last thing I would recommend, for Kanban teams is definitely, retrospectives, kind of like the way we do them in Scrum. You don't have to wait every 2 weeks. They don't have to be 2 hours or 1 hour. You can do them once a week, once a day for 10 minutes. It's up to you. Your team's going to always inspect and adapt and figure it out. Last thing I have is actually some Q&A and kind of engage the room a little bit. So I'll take some volunteers. Yeah, not even 5 minutes, Brian. So. So, what is cycle time? Did we get to volunteer someone if they don't raise their hand? Okay.
So hopefully I'm getting the terms correct, but it's the length of time it takes a task to go through your flow from beginning to end?
That's it. Average
How do
time.
you define beginning and end?
On your workflow states, when you start it up, wherever it ends, your done state, that's the end.
So just
When it leaves backlog?
From the time it leaves what you call the backlog or whatever that item is to when it hits done.
and done is in production,
Yeah.
so all the way to
Well, it could be wherever your done is, could be to production, it could be to a staging server, however you set it up. Toyota, I think they measure it by the time where you pull a ticket and the entire automobile is built and shipped off to a car lot or however they do it. Well, I kind of just answered that one. So. Stephen.
Nissan, right?
No.
Toyota.
Toyota.
I bet Nissan probably uses it too.
They started it, right? Everybody copied it.
They may. I'm not sure. What is a whip limit?
The maximum number of work you can have in the queue.
Yeah, in a workflow state. So each one of those states. Good. In Kanban, what role manages and prioritizes the work that needs to be done?
That's kind of a trick question because Kanban doesn't assign roles explicitly.
Very good. Yeah, I just put on there are no explicit rules. I mean, someone is going to do it, whether that's one person or the team, call them whatever you want, but yeah, that's the answer. How does Kanban help in mitigating and troubleshooting bottlenecks? Stephen. That is one way, yeah. It visualizes your bottlenecks, limited whip. There's a lot of good answers on this one. Now, this one's kind of easy. What does visualize the workflow mean? You're gonna have to give him 2 tickets, Brian. He's like,
You can see how the work is going through steps, and you can color code them.
right. So when you just split those work into pieces with your workflow states, and then you name your columns, whatever represents your organization, how y'all move things in and out. This is the last question. What are some differences between Kanban and Scrum?
Less prescriptive?
Okay.
All the steps are options.
I mean, you got it, man. That's the main answer. Scrum is a lot more prescriptive, which is kind of funny to say because Scrum's really not all that prescriptive anyway. Kanban is even less, which is why I think Kanban, playing with it for the last few months, it's a very disciplined process.